roles were reversed, that would be bad.
Except,
So-
Mr. Skundy, where is your rose?
That's right, Jerry.
Well, I'm not as highly compensated as Mr. Lucas, so I can't afford those things.
I grow them myself.
Well, good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the board. Let me introduce myself, especially for the benefit of Member Doduk, who probably doesn't remember me, but I'm Jerry Sekendi, President of the California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan trade association of business, labor, and public figures that have an interest in the environment. I'd really like to thank the board for this opportunity to present our report on a clear path to cleaner water. We've actually been working on this for almost 2 years. I apologize for the length, but believe it or not, this has really been cut down substantially from the initial drafts. I don't expect you to read each and every word, but there's some good executive summaries up front, and then as you go through it, you'll see some meat as you delve into the report. Our group itself is a collection of private and public experts, many of whom provide essential public services such as water and power. We're talking about counties, cities, sanitation districts, public entities, etc. It's a very broad spectrum of people that we brought together almost 2 years ago. We recognize that the State Water Board, regretfully, has limited resources, and that is not probably going to change anytime in the near future. And the same is true for the many sectors of the regulated community, especially those same cities and counties and sanitation districts. And I think we all recognize that we can't tackle all the problems at once to the best of our ability, given those limited resources, and that we need to concentrate on those things that are really the highest priorities. We would also urge you to have more public participation, although we recognize that especially for the EJ community, that is a very difficult proposition, even for the environmental community, the more traditional environmental community, given their limited resources also. But public participation, I think, is a real key to what we hope to propose to you. What we are suggesting is a framework and suggestions that hopefully will assist the board in achieving its objectives, not only for clean water, but also for sustainable practices and a much higher use of recycled water. I'm just going to leave you with 2 thoughts. Most of our presentation is going to be done by Dr. Susan Paulson, but I want you to listen to very carefully these next 2 thoughts. This is not an attempt by the regulated community to get out from under regulation. Number one, you would never allow us to do that, and we recognize that. But if you hear that, that's exactly what we are not attempting to do. And nor is it an attempt by the regulated community to avoid its financial responsibilities. We certainly all recognize that we have those responsibilities. Rather, our report points to a different approach that might achieve the outcomes that we all desire. I'd like to thank very much Dr. Susan Paulson and her colleague, Tony Maggio of Flow Science, for their hard work and dedication in preparing the report. And Dr. Paulson is going to go through what I will call kind of the executive summary, hit the highlights, and then Bob Lucas is going to wrap it up at the end.
I have to figure out how to work the microphone and
very,
the...
very closely to it.
Okay, here we go. Is that all right? Okay. You know, it was interesting in listening to the discussion before lunch. I was struck by a couple of things that, I don't know, maybe warrant a little bit of comment before we get into this. The first one is that the POTW recommendations and ideas seem to be much more concretely evolved, much more clearly stated. And I think there are probably several reasons for that. Most of the regulations in our way of writing permits, developing TMDLs, et cetera, really is well tailored for point sources, traditional point sources. And I think we have a much harder time figuring out how to handle and deal with non-point sources. And I kind of, even though stormwater, you know, MS4 might be a point source category, I put that in that lump. And when we get to other more diffuse sources, non-point sources, groundwater, you know, things like that, it's much, much more challenging to figure out how to regulate those and to get to outcomes. And funding is a whole another layer. The point sources, the POTWs, have a way of raising funds to implement various things. And the other categories really don't. And so I think all of our work has tried very hard to recognize that, and we've given a lot of thought to the differences between those kinds of categories and discharges and how our regulatory system might be able to respond to those differences to get to better outcomes. Jerry went through this. We, convened in 2012. We've been thinking, a lot of us, about these ideas for far longer than that. I think, really, if we were to crystallize what we're trying to accomplish with this report, it's that we really think that we can get better water quality outcomes if we identify and focus on the greatest threats, also echoing what I think Chair Marcus said earlier, regarding water of whatever origin as a resource. That might include stormwater, it might include certainly recycled water, it might even include contaminated water. Right. The need to clean up groundwater basins and to integrate all of these different sources of water into our supply stream, into our thinking on storage, and into our overall approach to water supply and environmental accountability. So, focusing on the greatest water quality threats, trying to, this is again is echoing some of what was said this morning, promote sustainable multi-benefit solutions to not only water quality problems, but water supply problems as well. Knowing that we're going to have to be much more collaborative and much more creative in solving problems, especially for the non-point, hard-to-treat water quality issues. And incorporating better science, best data. In short, thinking about this, working smarter about how we deal with water quality and water supply. So that's sort of the underlying premise behind everything that we tried to do here. And figure out how to advance this. There we go. We tried very hard to stay within the bounds of existing law, existing regulations, existing policy, existing guidance, and to figure out how we can work smarter within the framework and the structure, the regulatory structure that we already have. So a lot of what we did echoed back to the resource alignment report, which is your report from a little over a year ago, noting that the resource allocation mix where we devote our resources may not always reflect the most important water quality or water allocation concerns, that we need to think about setting priorities and funding programs a little bit more holistically, a little bit more broadly. And then importantly, we have found recent guidance, it's guidance from EPA headquarters to all of the regions that really echoes this. Finding that we do have flexibility within the confines of the Clean Water Act as currently drafted to identify cost-effective and protective solutions, to implement the most important priorities first, and to figure out how we sequence events to recognize the financial constraints that we're all working under. We have to. Again, this is echoing the same thoughts. EPA's existing regulations and policies do provide us with the flexibility that we need to set appropriate compliance schedules, to look for innovative solutions, to sequence capital investments and capital improvement projects, and to focus on protecting human health and the environment when we do that. We also, SEEB and the task force, looked at California's broad environmental goals. We've set some really ambitious goals for increasing recycled water use, for augmenting stormwater capture, for developing and protecting local water supplies, certainly for improving water quality. I don't have to tell you that, both point and non-point pollution, and also for energy use and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And it's our view that when you step back and take a broad look at this, all of these things really fit together. So what we did was to try to develop a framework for how we think we can set priorities and get to better outcomes. And the bulk of the report deals with this framework. We only have one slide here really summarizing it. In step one, you would define the process. You'd figure out, are we looking at a specific water quality standard? For example, are we looking at recreational uses and water quality objectives for bacteria? Or are we looking at this a little more holistically as a regional or a watershed scale planning exercise? Trying to figure out who needs to be involved, to solicit public involvement, to figure out how you fund the effort that you're undertaking, and to define the scope, set the ground rules basically up front. Step two would be looking at the water quality standards using the tools that are already there in Port of Cologne to incorporate the best available data and science into the process, and to start the process of establishing priorities, figuring out where your biggest risks are, your biggest threats are. Step three is something really that is incorporated in the state's anti-degradation policy now, which focuses on waters that are already of high quality. It's the maximum benefit concept. And we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but I think that especially for non-point diffuse sources, this could be a very valuable tool in helping us make progress in improving water quality. And again, we'll discuss this in a little more detail. But step 3 would be to think about the maximum benefit, the overall broader goals, and how the regulations, policies, permits, TMDLs, et cetera, fit into that overall picture. And then step 4 would be to develop a program of implementation and execute that. That would be to focus on the highest priorities, phasing the implementation actions that we undertake. Would involve revising what's usually Chapter 4 of the Basin Plans, the strategic planning and implementation section of the Basin Plans, to allow that phased approach to be implemented. And we've also tried to focus on sustainability and sustainable solutions, multi-benefit projects, for a variety of reasons.
Dr. Paulson, real quick, on step 2, when you say assess water quality standards, is that assessing the standards themselves to update them, or is it maybe more to assess attainment of water quality standards that exist, or both?
Really, I think step 2 gets to the assess the standards themselves, and step 4 gets to the assessing the attainment, a monitoring and surveillance program. So if you think about it in terms of Port of Cologne, step 2 would pull in section 13241 and the 6 sort of public interest factors, and step 4 would be where you'd pull in 13242 and developing a program of implementation. They aren't independent. You can't do it really stepwise. You have to do them in an interrelated fashion, but that's sort of how it would break out. All right. In addition to the framework, the executive summary of the report and throughout the report identifies, I think, 8 concrete recommendations that the task force would like to propose. The first would be to develop a policy for stakeholder participation and funding. We have examples throughout the state of stakeholder processes, some of which have been very successful, some of which have had some problems, some of which are less successful. Having additional guidance or policy to figure out how we can implement those stakeholder processes more efficiently, make better use of everybody's knowledge, time, experience, et cetera, would be really helpful. Basically to set the ground rules up front, and to echo some of what a couple of the groups said this morning, to foster a more certain regulatory environment for when we do have these processes, for incorporating the decisions that they arrive at, the science, the data that they pull into the process, into the regulatory decision-making process in an efficient and timely manner. And we certainly have a lot of lessons we can learn from past stakeholder processes. So to sort of capitalize on that as well. The report also contains 3 specific case studies where this framework essentially has been implemented already. The first of them, or one of them, is the Stormwater Quality Standards Task Force. This was a task force in the Santa Ana region that incorporated the regional board, the regulated community, other stakeholders, including NGOs. Was funded by the 3 counties, although the regional board was a participant, a signatory to the process. And what that task force did, was to review the scientific basis for the bacteria water quality objectives, to conduct beneficial use surveys. In a lot of these channels, they put cameras out for a year that took a photograph every 15 minutes during daylight conditions so that you could really see and understand what was happening in those channels. Looking at different sources of bacteria, it was mentioned again this morning, but bacteria is a particularly tough one because there are a lot of sources of bacteria and they're biological. They can regrow in the environment. So that makes regulating them very challenging. Then looking at the different control options that are available, from diversions to treatment, including disinfection, and then looking at implementation priorities. And the pictures along the bottom are, I think, examples of that. On the left-hand side, you see the Santa Ana River in a high flow condition when it's not very safe to be in the river. In the middle, you see a channel, a concrete line, essentially flood control channel in the Inland Empire, which has very, very little water in a dry flow condition and looks a little bit like the channel on the left, except it's concrete lined in a high flow condition. It's not very attractive for recreation. And then you have the main stem of the Santa Ana River, which is the picture on the right, where we know we have people on a regular basis. So when we think about setting priorities for implementing treatment controls or other measures to control water quality, we would suggest that it might make more sense to focus on situations like the one in the picture on the right, where we know we have exposure over the other situations. So this case study is outlined in great detail and walking through the various factors in the report. Then recommendation 2 is developing a maximum benefit policy. So the State Board's Resolution 6816 is the current anti-degradation policy. And it specifies that in waters of existing high quality, better than needed to attain standards, any change in those standards or objectives would need to be to the maximum benefit of the people of the state and would need to protect present and anticipated beneficial uses. And in discussions with several of you, it's been suggested that it would be useful to be able to apply these maximum benefit concepts more broadly than to just waters that are of existing high quality, but to all waters of the state as a planning tool. And we have a case study in the report, which is the Nitrogen TDS Task Force, again out of the Santa Ana region. And in this case, the Santa Ana Board and the stakeholders identified 5 different specific cases where maximum benefit concepts can be used to adjust water quality objectives. And those would be to maximize potable water supply, to provide net environmental improvement that could include to facilitate groundwater cleanup projects, to displace the demand for potable water to meet a compelling state interest, which could include flood control, other things, and to increase the use of recycled water, both within the region and in the state. There are many more details. The idea here, I think, as it would apply to non-point source issues as well, is that sometimes we can accomplish much more on a regional or a watershed basis than we can by regulating point source discharges alone. And so this maximum benefit idea would be intended to promote those kinds of creative collaborative solutions. All right, recommendation number 3 is to promote sustainable solutions. And the report cites to EPA's recent, I think it's February 2012, handbook on sustainability planning and to the recent EPA memos on integrated and sustainable planning. The idea here is that where we can work with sustainable solutions, green infrastructure, multi-benefit projects, we might really be able to solve a number of problems all at once. And the example shown here is the Dominguez Gap wetlands. It's a before picture on the left, what this flood control channel looked like before a pretty extensive restoration effort, and then on the right after. And you can see that it still provides a flood control benefit, has the capacity to carry storm flows, but it also provides recharge, it provides recreation, and it's just much more attractive. The third case study that we have is about multi-benefit watershed planning. We've got several other examples in there. The one that's shown here is the Sun Valley Park drain and infiltration system. This is an area that had chronic flooding, even in relatively small-sized storms. And I'm going to mess it up if I try to list them, but there were a number of federal and state and local partners that came together to fund this project that improves green space. It puts infiltration galleries, it's a little hard to read the figure, but infiltration galleries in under ball fields and things like that to promote infiltration and to retain essentially all of the stormwater that would have flooded and would have hit this area. So another advantage of these multi-benefit projects is that there's tremendous community support for them, and it can be easier to obtain funding. And that, of course, is a challenge. Recommendation number 4 in the report is to develop a stormwater policy. And when we talk, this isn't written down anywhere in this PowerPoint, but in listening to the discussion this morning about the point versus the non-point, and the way in which we regulate discharges to meet certain standards, I think all of the task force members are concerned that if we push to a very stringent numeric limits type of approach on stormwater, we're going to end up with very energy-intensive hardscape solutions, putting in concrete treatment facilities, as opposed to working within the natural landscape and focusing on green solutions. And I think we would suggest to you that we actually have a choice that we can make here to whether we go to a very stringent, meet a certain limit all the time kind of solution, or to allowing more sustainable green solutions and green infrastructure, which will meet those levels almost all of the time, but maybe not all of the time. But they also provide a number of other benefits. So there's a fairly detailed section in the report where we lay out the different options that might exist for stormwater regulation, the kinds of data and information that we would need to support each of those options, and the choices we have to make. And there are some creative alternative approaches out there, like Santa Ana's sector-specific metal recyclers permit, that we discuss as well. Okay, recommendation number 5. I don't think there's actually anything new here. The idea would be to provide guidance to the regional boards on the thresholds and evidence that would be needed to designate existing and probable future beneficial uses. And I think it's just pulling together existing EPA guidance and state board precedential decisions on the probable future beneficial use to really clarify what we mean by those definitions and to help facilitate the planning process so that we can set priorities.
Can you, before you go to recommendation 6, can you give some examples? Because one of the areas where there's beneficial use dispute sometimes is over-contaminated. Oh, sorry. Over-contaminated groundwater. Sometimes you have people saying that in terms of it's an issue we have with fracking at the moment and working it through in the new Dogger regs, which is, can you just talk a little bit more about this in terms of concrete examples of where this can get in the way and where there's an opportunity? Because there are people, for example, the pre-existing regs or the proposal would say, if it's not already clean, triage it as a beneficial use, whereas EPA guidance and our recommendation is, if it's completely polluted, contaminated, you don't worry about it quite as much. But all groundwater that's accessible is a potential drinking water source with treatment. So where do you draw the line? Or are you thinking about something else? Or are you thinking like the Santa Ana bacterial objectives, looking at recreation as the kind of issue you're getting at here?
All of those things. Groundwater is particularly complicated in some ways because it can be a potable supply source, which falls under drinking water regulations. If you pull it out and clean it up and treat it, or if it seeps into receiving water streams, surface water streams, that falls under a different set of regulations. If there's stormwater that recharge, that might be treated differently in terms of how we regulate it. So groundwater is really complicated, but I think we need to realize that we have a tremendous resource. I mean, I know, I've been looking at this recently, that we've got over 3 million acre feet of empty sitting available storage space in Southern California groundwater basins. And if we could use that storage space essentially to bank recycled water, stormwater supplies, to take advantage of imported water when it's available, that's a huge resource. I mean, that's equivalent roughly to the amount of surface storage that we have in Southern California. And yet those groundwater basins, as you mentioned, some of them are compromised, have some contamination. And I think if we somehow were to take a more holistic approach to those groundwater basins and recognize the resource that we have there, maybe we could develop a more integrated strategy to cleaning them up or to managing the contamination such that we can use the water, you know, for the highest beneficial use, potable or whatever, and work that into our overall water supply, water quality strategy. So I think it's very complicated, but I think that may be one area where the maximum benefit concept could be really useful. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, recommendation number 6, you've heard this a lot. I don't know if I need to spend a lot of time on it, but again, echoing the idea that it would really be helpful to have some standard economic analysis procedures. We know and recognize that the state and the regional boards do economic analyses. We also know that you don't have to do a cost-benefit analysis. But I think there's probably more that we can do with economic analysis to help set priorities and identify and define efficient implementation actions so that we're making the best use of the resources that we have, and we're balancing competing uses as well. A lot of the TMDLs that the task force discussed, and there are a few examples in the report, focus on implementation actions that are intended to meet water quality standards. And I think we might benefit from thinking about the economic analysis in terms of articulating we would achieve this benefit, not just complying with standards, but what is the benefit we would achieve with a given implementation action, and looking at a range of alternatives in that fashion so that we can define the most efficient water quality outcome. And I think there's a Form 399 that's used in some other areas of the state. The state board, I'm not sure of the history of it, but hasn't used that form, has been exempt from that as a model for the economic analysis. But there are other models in different agencies, departments within the state. And I think that we could either we could think of economic analysis in just the context of water quality and water regulation, or we could think of it a little bit more broadly. And I don't think we have a concrete recommendation as to which way would be better, but that it's a very valuable tool that would be helpful to incorporate in a clearer manner in our decision making. Recommendation number 7, to expand the use of scientific data, research, and planning. Echoing again a lot of what we heard this morning, to fine-tune some of the monitoring requirements to make sure we're collecting the right data in the right amounts, to let us know if things are getting better or worse, and to be able to fine-tune our implementation actions. And then we also recognize that the state has swamp gamma databases. There are also regional efforts, SFEI, SWRCB, others, who are doing really, really good things and trying to integrate efforts. The state board has also developed the office, what is OEMA, the Office of Information Management and, Assessment? Analysis, whatever it is, that A. And building on those efforts and integrating them, I think, could just give us a more concrete, comprehensive way of sharing information and making sure that we're using the best, most current information when we make decisions. And then the last recommendation doesn't even echo, it copies. We've plagiarized the 2005 report that was commissioned by the State Board on the role of science and engineering in decision making. And here there were 4 specific recommendations that we've pulled in wholesale. One would be to develop blue ribbon science panels to provide advice and guidance on specific but complicated science issues. Another would be that it might be useful to develop a science advisory panel that would be available to the regional boards, sort of an on-call or as-needed basis, to help review available information and data, interpret field data, and figure out what the science is really telling us. The third would be to develop some in-house experts that would be available on an as-needed basis. 2 areas that we've called out in the report where that might be useful would be for economics, economic analysis, and or risk assessment. And then the last would be where we don't have in-house expertise, to provide a mechanism for finding it and obtaining it. And I think that could probably build on the peer review process that we currently have, but in a slightly different context, maybe more on the front end as opposed to the back end. In short, the recommendations that we're making are intended to start a discussion about how we can identify, plan for, implement the state's environmental goals and the goals the state has for its waters, to get the most done with the limited resources we have, and to try to incorporate, to the extent that we can, the principles of sustainability planning and green infrastructure, green solutions. And really all of this is intended to support the sort of overlying or overarching principle of Port of Cologne, to make the highest use of the water that we have, and to consider all of the values involved, beneficial, detrimental, economic, social, tangible, and intangible, and incorporate that in our decision making. And with that, I'll pass it to Bob.
Thank you. My presentation is actually very short, and the purpose of it isn't to explain what we've done. It's rather to help us focus our thoughts as to where we might be going. So this one slide is a summary of the 8 recommendations that are discussed in the report. In most part, they are all based on case study reviews where we've seen things that have worked very well, some things that have worked better than others, and so forth. And what we've done here is break it down into what form these summary of potential actions might take. Several of these, the stakeholder participation funding, for example, and the maximum benefit issue and the stormwater, seem to lend themselves well to state policy, where you use the opportunity to take a look at each one of these items separately in a way that helps to standardize the way people in the field are doing it, so that we get the desired outcomes we're looking for, both encouraging more stakeholder participation and laying out the ground rules for it, helping to work through the funding for it. On maximum benefit, there are a lot of subtleties there that need to be worked through. And obviously on the stormwater side, we've been talking about a state stormwater policy for years. it's coming to light again that this may be the right time to sit down and work on it. We also have a set of suggestions that aren't quite at the heavy lift of the major policies, but still suggests that some guidance is in order from the state level. This is to promote the sustainable solutions, and as was pointed out earlier today, it's not just state and regional boards that are involved in these, it's all sorts of local governments and special districts, and there's a wide assortment of potential sustainable solutions if we have some guidelines there that would help people organize in a way that they might be able to access available funds and pursue them. Designation of beneficial uses, this is more of an in-house issue for you and the regional boards, but we think it is important because the beneficial use designations last for years. And there may be unintended consequences of designations that were made for one reason 15 years ago, then those reasons may not necessarily apply now going into the future, but it may be costly in order to apply them, so it would make use to look at what type of guidelines do you want the regional boards to follow in actual designation of beneficial uses. And then this last set, these are a little different. These are more of procedural things. We talk about standard economic analysis. What the report suggests is that we take a look at whether Cal EPA might want to do this on its own for all of the Cal EPA agencies. Maybe, as Adamo has pointed out, the Resources Board has a good model that might be used. Maybe just some modifications of the current model that you're using right now and have it applicable to the regional board so that we have a standardization. But what we are suggesting, though, is that there's more use to an economic analysis than we think has been applied in the past in order to take a look at whether or not, in fact, let me just read one statement here to you. The goal of economic evaluation should be to ensure that water quality regulations are efficient such that the anticipated outcome warrants the expenditure of resources needed to achieve that outcome. We don't ordinarily get to that point in the economic analysis that we're producing today, and it might be a good idea to step back and reconsider that. And of course, the use of data has been talked about quite a bit today, not only moving forward and collecting new data, but also deaccelerating, if you might, to take a look at whether or not the data you've already collected still needs to be collected, or perhaps there's some efficiencies there, you don't need it anymore, it served its purpose, we can move on. And that's more of a management issue than anything else. Incorporation of best science and engineering, it sounds like a no-brainer, but it's the kind of thing that might require some dollars in order to promote. So all of these potential actions involve different types of efforts, primarily here at the Water Board, maybe it's at Cal EPA. It may require some work over at the legislature. We don't want to stop just by producing a report. We want to help you take the most advantage of it that you see that fits your purpose. So these are the actions that are suggested by the recommendations that are in the report. You may think some of these are really good. You may think some of them are not. You may have an entirely set of priorities you'd like to apply to them, but we do think that they do warrant attention, and we thank you for giving us the time today to make this presentation.
Let me just add one thing to piggyback on what Bob just said. I was around during the 2005 report. Ms. Dodak may remember that. And one of the reasons I think that we didn't hire the scientists, we didn't have the outside panels, was a question of funding. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we're recommending in terms of economic analysis is it would be nice if you had some economists on your staff. That goes back to funding, and your lack of flexibility in terms of using funding from one pile, putting it in the other pile, and I am acutely aware of that. But we are more than happy to work with you and work with the members of the legislature to see if we can't get you some of that flexibility, because we think you desperately need it.
Thank you. I'm going to let her go first, because I keep letting you go first.
On the on the maximum benefit, that is a concept that is embedded in the anti-DEG policy, and it's my understanding that the way it was used, particularly in Region 8, is that it was used to not to pick. It was to allow some degradation, but not forever. It was to allow some degradation and then a path toward getting back to and beyond the degradation that, or the standards that were there. And so I think that's a concept that we would want to as we explore this, make sure that it's not an end unto itself. It really is a path forward and up.
Yeah, and I think the Santa Ana case is really good in a couple of ways. Those were water quality objectives that were set in the early 70s. And the water quality in those basins had gotten saltier than those original objectives over time. So the basins didn't, at the current time then, meet the water quality objectives that had been established. And for that reason, they couldn't accept recycled water or imported water or other supplies. They really couldn't be used as a storage reservoir in a way that would make sense for Southern California's water reliability and water supply. So the board recognized that adjusting those objectives would allow us to use those basins in that fashion. But the new objectives basically recognized water quality at the time and or what might hit in a short time period. They were fully protective of the beneficial use. They weren't as high as the salinity objectives for drinking water can be. And they were part of an integrated plan. So another thing that the Santa Ana regional stakeholders did as part of that process is to figure out the salt management question, to make sure that the downstream basins didn't get far worse, and to figure out how to export salt so that they could maintain a reasonable salinity level. So it was very much part of an integrated water supply, sustainability, resources planning exercise. And there were very significant financial resources invested in the salt management, the overall process, but also the brine lines and the salt management process. So, yeah, I agree with you.
Is that okay? I'll just go to this side and I'll go to this side.
Curious about integrated regional water management plans. It just seems to me that that is an approach that's being used with more and more frequency throughout the state. And are you seeing, with respect to the more comprehensive solutions, stormwater, groundwater, integrated approaches, are you seeing that those plans get advanced up to a point and then they hit the wall with regulation? And if so, I'm just looking for ways that we could move forward without necessarily wholesale changes initially. Are there some baby steps that we could take in order to better inform the process before making major changes?
The MS4 permittees who were part of the task force felt that the IRWMP process was a very valuable planning tool. It doesn't exist everywhere. So I think we'd say that where we have them, let's use them. But where we don't, let's not do some of this other good stuff. One of the main concerns with the MS4 permittees was with permit language about, never ever cause or contribute to an exceedance of receiving water objectives. The reason that the Sun Valley project worked is because the ground underlying that area had tremendous infiltration capacity. And once they built infiltration galleries, they had a place to put the water. They didn't have the runoff and the MS4 permit concern about exceeding certain specified levels. I think the MS4 permittees, where they don't have that infiltration capacity, that ability to retain, find it much harder to implement sustainable green solutions because they're worried about permit compliance. I don't know what the solution to that tension is, but I think there's got to be something in the middle ground. And I think the IRWMP tool, if we can maybe think about stormwater or maximum benefit or all of these concepts a little bit differently, can be more efficiently implemented. So right now sometimes there is a lot of planning that's done but not a whole lot of implementation that occurs. I think in part because of the tension between the regulatory requirement and the projects we'd like to build, and a concern about being in a way almost caught in a trap. Do you have anything to?
No, I think you covered that.
And then the second question is, well, first of all, this is a really good report. Thank you. And your offer to continue to work with us so that it doesn't just collect dust. What would you propose as far as next steps? And then maybe when we're all finished, if we could hear from staff about maybe staff's thoughts on how to have some of the discussions going forward. And if you could also mention any involvement that you've had with other stakeholder groups. or plan to in the future?
Thank you. Why don't I start to try to answer that? With regard to other stakeholder groups, we did give fairly broad circulation to the first draft of this report in order to get as much comment back as we could. And this report has been very comprehensively rewritten because of those comments that we did receive back. Now, to the extent that we received positive comments from NGOs, we'd love to sit down and work through them with them and with you. On a lot of the items, though, that we listed in the report, we didn't get comments back from NGOs. We did get some comments back from the board. We did get some comments back from staff. We were listening very keenly this morning when you were talking about next steps and how the current process you have going down with the stakeholder groups can be advanced. We'd like to continue to try to be part of that. So as you do create a schedule for bringing people back in or for having meetings of different groups, it would be nice if we could be included in that. And by the same token,
We always like to see you. We were going to actually bring back linear permits just so you'd have something to do. I'm only kidding. We said we didn't want to have to see you again on that.
well, if that's the case, then perhaps you can choose one that I didn't get my way with. In any event, and we're always available to the staff as well. Jerry, do you want to?
Yeah, let me just add, in terms of full disclosure, this has been a 2-year process, and we've learned a great deal in the 2 years also. And when we did send it out to NGOs, and it was a fairly wide distribution, the first comments we got back were, well, in terms of your recommendations, we could work with you in terms of sustainability, we could work with you in terms of, I think it was data collection was the second one, but in terms of your other 6 recommendations, basically we are so fundamentally opposed that there's no reason to talk to you. I think the underlying message was, you're a regulated community and maybe all you're trying to do is get out from under regulation. And again, if that's the message you're getting from us, we have failed, because that's exactly what we're not trying to do. We are more than willing with, frankly, this new report, and we have not had this is fresh off the press. I mean, literally, as of this morning, you got your printed copies. So this week, we will be sending out at least the PDF forms to the NGO community and have them comment on this again. And I'd be very, very curious. Hopefully, the tone and the approach is remarkably different than it was the first time around, because we have learned some things, and we have taken into account some of their comments.
Great.
And in terms of where we go from here, and I know Susan and I have been talking about this in terms of next steps, we would love to see you take the framework that we have outlined and apply it in some very specific situations. And do you want me to plunge in, or do you want to plunge in? Either one. We love stormwater, okay? It's just warm and fuzzy.
Mhm.
And frankly, it does not lend itself to a point source solution, I think, as all 5 of you certainly recognize at this point in time. Numeric limits for stormwater, across the board is not something that's going to work. We'll end up in hardscape. It's not what I want to see. I live in Southern California, in Pasadena. I want to see grassy swales. I want to see permeable surfaces. I want to see more catch basins. I want to see more spreading fields. That's where I'm at. I want to see Southern California, frankly, self-dependent, or independent, I should say, in terms of its water. And I think it can get just about there, given its current resources and given its current storage capabilities, if we utilize those. So I would love to see our framework take place in terms of a statewide policy on stormwater. That's one. I'll give you number 2.
I have a short list, I guess.
Better to do that.
There are a few stakeholder processes, and some of the groups this morning talked about it as well. The incorporation of WERs, the conversion factors for dissolved to total metals, some studies that have been done that have a hard time finding their way into basin plans or permits or TMDLs or regulatory processes. The Stormwater Quality Standards Task Force, that is one of the case studies that we have, I don't think that's been before you yet, and I don't think it's on your calendar, but the next step in that process would be state board adoption. And it really follows pretty closely, even though that whole process happened before this report. It follows fairly closely, some of the recommendations here. I think in terms of TMDLs, I think it would be helpful for the regional boards and maybe state board staff as well to understand that I think there's flexibility, and I think EPA's guidance affords flexibility and makes some suggestions specifically about how that flexibility can be implemented in terms of what implementation actions are required on what schedule of whom. and whether or not there's funding, grant funding, fees, taxes, whatever you can do to raise that money. I mean, that is one of the biggest challenges we're going to have. And trying again to figure out what implementation actions are the most important, the most critical on a short time frame, and setting things up so we can do those things. I think the problems, the water quality problems that we have that are hardest, largely because we are based on a point source kind of a model, POTWs and industrial discharges and that kind of thing, are the non-point source pollution problems, the diffuse problems, where those intersect with groundwater. You know, it's just trouble in spades. And I think we may end up with some of the similar issues with legacy pollutants. And who pays how we decide what the implementation actions are going to be for compounds that we haven't used in 30 or 40 years or more. So I'd love to see a focus on creative and collaborative thinking as to how we solve those problems and how we get the solutions to those problems to fit within the current regulatory framework. I think we can do it, but it's hard.
And lest we think our task is small, let me just say that the idea of essentially policy conflicts internal to the Water Board's process is even greater when you leave the Water Board and start to interact with the Air Board, with toxics, with DWR, with
DPH and nitrates in groundwater.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so that issue has been identified in the AB 32 scoping plan as a long-term, medium-term, long-term challenge that the whole state has got to get a grip on. So we may be in the leadership on some of that.
Thank you. Thanks for the report. And I did get some previews, and I feel like a good a good stew. It's simmered longer on the stove. It's got the spices that were kind of biting at first have now mellowed out, and it's a nicer blend. No, I appreciate this. This resonates a lot with my philosophies and other board members about the need to have a greater vision of integration. I appreciate how you've articulated this in terms of the idea of maximum benefit. That's interesting. When we talk about economic analysis, we usually hear about costs, you know, like earlier today, and part of the economic analysis is the benefits. I'm not saying cost-benefit analysis per se, but the fact that the far-reaching effects of good policy making will be multiple benefits, as we've heard over and over again. And so, and then to Board Member Diadamo's question, you know, where does this find a home? And I heard pretty quickly it was within our MS4 or stormwater type regulation. You know, where's the rubber hit the road as far as where the water boards interface with decisions that land use and flood control and other decisions, and you know, where do we interface? So I did want to give staff the opportunity. I think you know where my head's at on all this. I want to do everything we can to integrate better with all of the different water supply, flood control, water quality issues. Does staff see a path forward working with interested stakeholders in current efforts? You know, where can we plug this kind of thinking in and interface with the regional water boards to really, you know, see these outcomes happen and reduce regulatory barriers to multiple benefit outcomes?
Would you like me to jump in? Because
Sure.
I heard a number of issues that in their summary of actions and moving forward, and and I think that we can move forward on many of them in a number of ways. As we talked earlier, we are convening later this summer, you know, putting together this idea of a stormwater work plan. What are the components of that? I don't know yet, but I expect they're going to have a lot of these common things. I mean, we're already conceptualizing the idea of how do we maximize multiple benefit projects? How do we integrate water supply? How do we deal with the conundrum that Jeff talked about, which is we tend to measure process and not outcome. But when we start talking about outcome, then people are very worried about being held accountable for things that they're not sure they can meet. And so it's not a simple solution of saying, oh, let's stop counting how many times you do inspections and start measuring the water quality. That there's issues you heard today. Numerics lead to hardscape solutions, or that's the concern. The issue of incorporating special studies into, I believe, it's hard for me to say, but I think I agree with Susan that we need to provide a lot of some guidance towards how do we do this, because we don't. It's unfair and I think it's just unfair to ask people to do special studies that are allowed for in our tool set, and then be so unsure of the outcome that we don't incorporate it. And so if we're unsure of how they should do it, we should provide that assurance up front so that we know what we're going to do. It's like asking for monitoring. You need to know what you want to answer with a question. And so it is one of the lower priorities right now in our policies, but we can evaluate as we move forward if how do we raise that up to do some of those processes. But I think it's something that we can do. I would like to actually put an invitation to Susan and to talk about TMDL implementation. We're trying some new things that in our statewide MS4, so the Caltrans and the small municipals, to take a different approach to implementation of TMDLs. And so I've been meeting with folks about this. I'd love to meet with Susan and her folks about the approach of trying to focus on actions that we know will solve problems instead of on creating plans and in that approach. I don't at all object. I don't know how to get to this kind of general idea of creative and collaborative solutions. We have been trying to do that for a long time, and I think we still have ways to go on it. And I think that some regions are better at it than others, and I think some folks at State Board are better at it than others. But we have been moving that forward, and I will think about how do we institutionalize that better than we're doing today. Those are really those main pieces that I got from your closing. And did I miss any when I was?
Well, you may want to take a close look at the case studies. They do, it is a fairly detailed review of the specific instances where different techniques were used. And you can tell by the outcomes just how successful or unsuccessful those techniques were. So there may be some food for thought in that part of the report.
Sure.
Yeah, I think we'll all look at every word of it, even though you said we didn't have to read every word, and reframe it. But now I want to turn to Tam, who's sort of on point on a lot of this before my comments.
Well, thank you. I actually had 3 questions, and Mr. Secundi addressed 2 of them already. So that mind meld from, your time on the board before you abandoned me, I guess, is still in place.
But she's not bitter.
Thank you, Jerry.
She is never,
I was
ever.
the beneficiary.
Let me live that down.
No, the 2 questions I had, which you addressed, were with respect to funding and the challenges with funding, and with respect to specific application of the framework. So that leaves me with my final question before I provide some comments. And this list of summary of actions, and it ties into what Mr. Bishop was saying. Did your task force have a discussion in terms of prioritizing these activities? If, we'd love to do them all, there's just, all at the same time, but that's just not feasible. So did you have a discussion in terms of which one your members feel would be most beneficial, would be able to accomplish in a short term? Prioritize for me.
Jerry, why don't you take that? You comfortable?
To be terribly honest with you, we discussed this at length. We did not want to, and I'm being honest, we did not want to usurp the prerogative of the State Water Board in terms of priorities.
Nice.
And that's the truth. We really didn't. We felt it would be a little bit hubris on our part to say this is what the State Water Board's priorities should be. Now, from a personal point of view, I can tell you that stormwater is probably the top of the list, quite frankly. It rears its ugly head, for lack of a better phrase, in at least 3 different permits, as you well know. It cuts across so many different aspects of water quality that if there's anything we'd like you to start to work on first, it would be stormwater.
Great.
That isn't from the group, that's from me, but Susan?
The one other thing that I would add to echo what Chair Marcus said is looking at water supply reliability and sustainability, because I think that that has benefits up and down the state. If we can increase the use of recycled water, capture more stormwater, all of those things, we're going to reduce the amount of imported water that we need to carry from one part of the state to the other. That has energy benefits, that has greenhouse gas benefits. It has all sorts of economic benefits if we get into a prolonged drought situation when we're thinking about climate change and how that's going to make things worse. To me, it seems like we're already late in working on those issues and in planning for those things. So I think I'd think about that. And one other thing that struck me earlier that's not part of the report that, is just my thinking. We have demonstrated some flexibility in the past in implementing things. For example, the City of San Diego has a 301H waiver for the discharges that go to the ocean, and that'll be up again. Part of the reason that they've had that waiver is because they've been looking at alternative ways to use that wastewater, and I think they've made tremendous progress. I mean, their City Council just a couple of months ago elected to proceed with the indirect potable reuse concept, doing advanced purified treated water and putting it into surface water supply reservoirs. And I think we have a lot more confidence technologically, fail-safe, monitoring-wise, et cetera, that we can do those things now. Right. But our regulations haven't necessarily caught up with us. That's State Board, but it's also DPH. It's, it's systemic. And it would be wonderful to really make some progress on those things in a very concerted, coordinated way.
Great.
Tam, I want to answer your question. I think getting a real grip on statewide data from stormwater, from recycled water, from conservation, possibly some other ideas, is going to be the pathway that we will need to get into funding, to get into better planning. And so if we're going to focus on something in the short term, I think it's figuring out who has the best data statewide and how you get it into the state so the state can actually use it to do planning and to move forward on stormwater and on all these other things. So I think that
I will actually take it one step further. I recently met with another former vice chair who abandoned us, Dr. Gary Wolf. And if you'll remember, Dr. Wolf, when he was on the board, was promoting the idea of a water quality or water data institute. Because, we've always had these concerns about, well, are we, do we have the capacity to manage all of this data? But also, more importantly, there's these concerns about confidentiality of data, about just, getting expertise to help us manage the data. And so I would like to revisit with staff at some point Dr. Wolf's idea of this water quality or water data institute. But before we do that, let me offer a suggestion to my colleagues and to staff. We heard earlier this morning the recommendations and reports from the 4 task forces as part of the